So before I start my talk, let me ask one simple question. What do you think? Is testing easy or not? What's your opinions? It depends, both, or maybe it's hard. So in fact, my opinion on this question is testing is not easy, but it's hard. Actually, the testing was hard when all of us, we deal with monolithic applications, when the backend of the system was one big thing that was developed as a whole, test as a whole, and released and deployed to production. The one big thing. So what do we supposed to do in this situation is just test such systems through its API or through its user interface. But as the systems evolve, many projects or many new applications started to be built using microservices architecture. And it gets even harder from the development point of view and also from the testing point of view. So right now, instead of one big thing that we need to test on the backend, we have a bunch of small services. Each of them has its API, and all these services working together and communicating through HTTP REST calls, messaging, or any kind of communication channels. So the contract testing can make your testing such applications a little bit easier and make your world, testing world, a little bit easier. So let's start with situation. Imagine that you and I, we all represent one good developer. Once upon a time, manager come to us and asked whether we can build a new shiny feature for our application. And the feature actually contains the main source code of the feature is placed in one service. It's called user conference service. And this feature evolves to and getting the call to other service, bonus conference service. The call is simple HTTP call to user balance endpoint. We are passing some couple of parameters and getting the data for our feature. So we have implemented the feature code, but as I mentioned it, you and I, we are responsible developers, so we created a test for what we have built just right for the feature. So first of all, what we need to start and where we need to start? We are starting, of course, from the obvious. It's unit tests. So the unit test actually for our feature and for any communication with external bonus conference service looks like here. So instead of getting a call to real service, we create a mock for this service and saying that when we make a call to user balance method with these particular parameters, then the bonus service should return this already prepared data. So what about the unit tests? The unit tests provide us really fast feedback, of course. The fast feedback for positive testing, for negative testing, or for any kind of similar testing. And also, the unit tests are executed locally. That's why they are fast. So we finished with the unit test. We created a bunch of them. And then just before deploying the new feature to production, we just need to check whether the feature works correctly. So we deployed it to some kind of environment. And as we are trying to test or trying to follow our feature, we reveal an unfortunate situation. On this testing environment, the integration between the user service and the bonus conference service is broken. Why it's happening and why we reveal it only on the environment? It's just because when we're creating the unit tests and using the mock of any external services, we are dealing with assumptions. So we assume that this other service, in our case it's bonus conference service, when we make a call to this service, it responds the data that we expect. But in fact, while we have implemented this feature and while we created this unit test, other developer make change to bonus conference service and break the integration. So what we can do in this situation? Of course, we can create API tests, end-to-end API tests. What it means? In this kind of test, we deploy to environment. We deploy user conference service, we deploy bonus conference service, we deploy other necessary dependencies, make them executed on this environment, and then execute our test. Inside of a test, we make a real call, HTTP call, with more or less real data from our service to bonus conference service. As a result, we get the test passed, and this test is more valid from the way how it's executed on the environment. Why we can't just write these end-to-end API tests and substitute unit tests? We need to spend time on deploying these services to any testing environment. And also, API tests are really slow comparing to the unit tests. So from one side, we have unit tests, which are fast and runs locally. And from other side, we have API tests, which runs on environment and slow. So what we can choose in this situation? Maybe we should stick to one kind of testing, maybe we should stick to API testing, and maybe we should do both. But maybe there is a third option that allows us to get the best from both worlds. So it can be fast as a unit test, but provide a real world result. And it turns out that the third option exists. It's contract testing. So instead of just writing unit tests or API tests, we are starting our work with creating a contract. The contract, actually, it's definition of communication between two counterparties. In our case, between user conference service and bonus conference service. In contract testing terminology, the service which makes requests to other service, it's called consumer, and the service which responds with some data, it's producer. So for each contract, we are creating the consumer test on consumer side and the producer test on producer side. And what's the main benefits we can get here in order to catch integration errors? Contract testing are executed locally. That's why the speed of execution of contract tests just a little bit slower than unit tests. So the contract tests are fast. But of course, the contract tests are not dealing with assumptions, with our assumptions. The contract defines how the integration between the services is really right now. And also, the contract tests are the same as end-to-end API tests. When we create them, the teams should communicate and should collaborate in order to get this contract done and in order to get the test on both sides done. Before we start with contract testing on your project, we need to choose what approach from contract tests we need to follow. The first option is to do producer-driven contract testing. It means that we have a producer with its endpoints, and for each endpoint, the producer service defines its own contract. And each consumer, each service which uses these endpoints should follow this contract. In some cases, the producer-driven contract testing approach is pretty good, but in most cases, the alternative way is better. Alternative way is consumer-driven contract testing. Why it's better? So, comparing to the producer-driven testing, in this, approach, the consumers defines the contract. So the main benefit here is for each endpoint of the producer, there can be a multiple consumers and multiple contracts. And in this particular case, this is an example. So imagine the producer has user balance endpoint and the two consumer services which works and uses endpoint. So for user conference service, we define in the contract, we define that we expect in response array of bonuses with some special data types. This data type has two properties, bonus ID and bonus type. For the other consumer, some other service, we expect from bonus services the same thing, but the only thing that other service cares is only bonus ID. The other service doesn't care about bonus type. That's why if bonus service in the future will change their API and remove bonus type at all, the contract test between user service and bonus service will be broken because the user service expects bonus type, but as for some other service, the integration will not be broken. So in this particular approach for the contracts, the producer can get a real feedback on how this particular change will affect integration with other services, with other consumers. So in Java world, there is two main mature tools for now that can be used for contract testing. The one is a Pact. It's more language agnostic tool, so you can use multiple tools for implementing the contracts in integrating between services. If on your project you are using Spring framework or Spring Boot, it is more suitable to use Spring Cloud Contract Library. My examples today will be based on Spring Cloud Contract, but the main ideas and main approaches are the same for both tools. So if you get the ideas from Spring Cloud Contracts, you can use it for Pact as well. So let's get some REST. Let's get some examples about contracts for communication using HTTP REST. Here is an example of the contract. The contract actually looks like special file. In this particular case, it's written in Groovy. And for REST communication, it contains two main parts. It contains the request part and the response part. In request part, what we need to define in the contract, it's of course the method of communication. In our case, it's get method. The URL that we are going to call for the producer. In our case, we are going to call bonus conference service and user balance endpoint. And of course, if it's applicable, we need to specify what query parameters we are gonna use. In our case, we have two parameters. The first one is user ID and the second one is session ID. The same thing is for the response. In the response section, the consumer, in our case user service, defines what it expects back from the producer, from the bonus service. In our case, of course, we are expecting that the response will be with status code 200. The format of the response will be JSON. That's why we are specifying that the headers will be with content type application JSON. And of course, the main thing here is that we are expecting some data from the producer service. So in our case, we are expecting an array which called bonuses, and inside the array there will be some value with properties bonus ID and bonus type. So basically what we need to remember about the definition of the contract in Spring Cloud Contracts. You have an options to specify these contracts into multiple languages for now. You can specify it on Groovy, YAML, Kotlin. In the latest releases, it supports Java. In the contracts, in general, and in Spring Cloud contract as well, we need to test, and we need to test inside the contract only the format of the request and the response. That's why inside the contract we heavily rely and heavily use regular expressions. So before moving on, just a little bit words about how the Spring Cloud contract works underneath. So actually, inside the Spring Cloud contract, there is a Maven plugin with the two main parts. The first one is used for consumer, and the second part is used for producer. For consumer, there is a stub runner, which is responsible for generating and running stubs. And for producer, it is contract verifier, which is responsible for generating and running tests. And the consumer test works like that. So based on the contract stub runner creates a stub. Inside the test, we are downloading the stub for your contract and use it for your tests. So the stub is generated using the tool called wiremock. So when we download this stub, we are running it on some port on your local machine, and when we make a request inside the test request to this stub, if a request is correct, it will return some data back. And inside the test, we will check whether this data is what we expect. That's why inside our test, we need to specify stub runner rule, which responsible also where we define which stub we are going to download for our test. In our case, in download stub method, we are passing actually for which producer service we are going to download stubs. And if we are using here the plus sign, we will discard any version of the stub, and we will download all the stubs available for this producer service. And the port, the vsport method, where we define on which port we will run this stub. If you don't want to download and generate all the stubs, because for the producer it can be multiple stubs, up to 10 or hundreds stubs, we can specify for which exact consumer we are going to download this particular stub. In our case, using the method withConsumerName, we are specifying that in this case, in this test, we are going to concentrate only on stubs between user conference service and bonus conference service. The test itself, it's like a little bit mixture between unit test and the API test. So the first thing, we are going to execute request to the bonus service, but instead of just executing a request to the real bonus service, we will execute this request to the stub. It will return the data that we have defined inside our contract. As we have this data, we need to make an assertions. So we have some data that we have defined in the contract, and we are checking that in our case we get the list of bonuses. The list is not empty, and one of the items, the first item in the list, has the expected properties, the bonus ID and bonus type. This is it. As for the producer, the situation is slightly more interesting and slightly more complex. So instead of downloading the stubs and running and creating the tests actually for producer side, what we are going to do here is, based on the contracts, Spring Cloud contract, and actually the contract verifier part, will generate the test for your contract. This test will be generated using the well-known Java library for API testing. It's called Rest Assured. So these tests that are generated based on the contracts are executed during the latest version of API of the producer. How it looks like. So here is a test that has been generated by the Spring Cloud contract based on the REST contract that we have defined before. So inside of this test, we have prepared data. So we have prepared the request. In our case, as we have specified, two query parameters, user ID and session ID, we have it. We make a GET request to the user balance endpoint. We get this response, and then everything that we have specified in this REST contract, every item, for every item, Spring Cloud contract will generate assertions automatically. So in our case, we have specified that we are expected status code will be 200. There is an assertion for it. We have expected that the response header, the content type, will be application JSON. Here is the assertion. The same is for values inside the body section. So we have assertion of everything that we have specified in the contract. The only thing that we as a developer or the tester need to specify for the producer side tests, we need to define the base class for the generated test. In our case, our generated test class, it's called REST test, extends from some base class. This base class should be written by the developer, and it contains the mocked data for the construct test. So in our case, we are just using the simplest mock here. We are creating the expected data type, expected data, the user bonus in our case, and then we are defining, using the Mockito mock, we are defining that when this service will be executed, when someone will make a call to get user balance method with user ID and session ID parameters, then we should return the list of bonuses. And this particular code will be executed inside the generated test class, inside this REST test class. So, what about the messaging? Because microservices communicating not only using REST endpoints and HTTP REST calls, but also in many cases using messaging. In Spring Cloud contract, we can use the messaging contracts as well. So how it looks like, how the contract looks like. It's similar to the REST, but instead of specifying the request and the response sections, we are specifying the input section and output message section. In output message section, we need to specify the topic name in the method send_to, the topic where the producer will place the message. And inside the body section, we are specifying actually the message itself. In our case, we will specify the message, and it has three properties: user ID, session ID, and some action. And in input section of the contract, we have triggered by method where we specify the name of the method which will be executed inside the producer test. So in the consumer test, the main idea here is we are preparing the expected message. Here is the expected message when we specify the data that we need to check. Then using the Spring Cloud class stop trigger, we are triggering the message to be test message from the contract will be sent to the topic. We are capturing, using message listener, capturing this message from this topic and comparing it to our expected message. The producer side is almost the same, but here we are defining in the abstract class, we are defining the method that we have specified inside the contract, And in this method, we need to specify to what topic we need to send some message. And as we have prepared in this particular case, we are preparing bonus update message, and we sent it to the update bonus topic. Then in the generated tests that have been generated by Spring Cloud contract, the message that we have used here will be compared to the generated assertions from the contract. Here is a question. Is it silver bullet which helps us to test everything inside a microservices communication? So the contract test, is it silver bullet? Of course not. Actually, for microservices, there is like more or less common test levels, and the contract test is only one of the levels. So when you have a contract, you need also to take care about the unit tests, about the component tests, end-to-end tests, and of course, exploratory. So the contract is only one thing that needs to be done. And of course, if you will start implement contract testing for your project, you will face with the challenges. The first one challenge is you need to have the technical training for the developers and particularly for the testers, because contract testing, actually implementation of the contract can be done like with a 1 hour workshop by any technical person, but as for the consumer test and producer test, it requires the knowledge of the language, in our case it's Java, and it also requires the knowledge of the Spring Boot. Also, if you want to start with a contract test, you need to be prepared with process changes. Because the contract itself, when it's implemented correctly, when you make a change to any contract and it breaks the contract, every consumer and every producer should respond to this change and fix it immediately. This is the essence of contract tests. We make a change, get integration error, and respond to it as soon as possible. If you ignore this test or doesn't care about this test, so the value will be 0. And also, in many cases, there should be additional technical setup for the contract tests. There is one way of doing contracts where you keep the contracts inside the producer service, but the other option is to have a separate repository of the contracts where producer services and consumer services will use the same repository of the contracts. So you need to create this repository and to take care of it. And the biggest challenge with the contract test, of course, is communication issue. So you need to prepare developers, your fellow testers. You need to prepare managers that if you are going to introduce the full process of contract tests, there should be a change in the process of development. When the teams start to define the contracts, there should be a communication, an agreement between the services that there is a contract that both counterparties, the consumer and the producer, are going to fulfill. If there is no communication between the teams, the contract tests and contract testing is useless at all. And the last question, is it for you, for your particular project? In most cases, like the first thing where contract tests can bring value is, of course, when your application is based on microservices. But the contract test can be implemented if you have a monolith application and some UI set of services. You can create a contracts and contract tests between the UI and the backend as a monolith. It is possible. But here is a couple of things that you may consider when you start implementing the contracts. First of all, if you have a communication issue between the teams, so you have a completely separate teams of developers, like backend developers, UI developers, DevOps, so the teams are completely different, and the process is like we have implemented some issue and throw it to the QA. We have tested some issue, throw it to DevOps for deploying. So in this particular case, contract test will not be successful and will not bring the value. In case if you want to substitute the functional tests with the contract testing, it is also will not bring the value, because the contracts, the essence of the contracts is check the semantics of the request. So we are dealing only with data types of the parameters in the request and in the response, and that's all. We are not testing functionality in contract tests. Of course, if you miss for now, if you don't have any unit tests for your services, if you don't have any component level tests for the service in isolation, implementing of contract tests will not bring so much value. It brings some, but the effort of starting contract tests without any other types of testing will be more big than with such tests available. And of course, if you think that contract test is just a fancy new thing that everybody talk about and you need to try it and play with it, of course you can try, but the implementation requires the changes for the whole development team. It's not like you have written the contracts in your local machine and everybody is using it. There should be a huge process change for your company. So what I want to say in conclusion: the contract tests can make our testing efforts of testing microservices systems a little bit easier if the contract tests have implemented correctly. The changes, and in contract testing world, contracts are a big changes. Changes are always hard to implement. You will have issues, definitely will have issues with convincing everybody why contract tests can bring the value. You will have issues with educating developers and saying that in this particular case, if we are changing in the contract, we need to change on the consumer and the producer side. This is the rules that can be violated. And in the end, if you are going to apply or introduce any new tool, any new approach, not only the contracts, but any, please choose wisely. Think before you applying something. Because in most cases, even the smallest change can bring the biggest value for your business and your automation and testing. My name is Oleksandr Romanov. I'm QA automation lead at gaming company Playtika. If you want to talk about automation, here is my contacts. And here is the time for the questions.